Good morning. Welcome to Wednesday in Open Education Week in Tennessee. It's been my pleasure. I'm Rachel Fleming, Scholarly Communications Librarian at University of Tennessee, Chattanooga. It's been my pleasure to put together this week of programming with the Tennessee Higher Education Commission's Textbook Affordability for Student Success Task Force. And this morning we're joined by some of my colleagues from the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, Carolyn Runyon, Director of Special Collections, Susaneckermanburgle Bergel, Associate Professor of History and Director of Africana Studies, and Dunstan McNutt, Instruction Librarian. And they're going to present to us about a team approach to open pedagogy through high impact practices and experiential learning. But before they get started, I have a couple of housekeeping notes. As you were entering, your video and audio were muted, and they'll remain that way throughout the session just to reduce background noise and the internet load, so everyone can hopefully have a better experience. If you have questions, go ahead and submit those through the chat, and the presenters will try and address those towards the end. We've had a couple of sessions already earlier this week, but we do have a couple of more tomorrow and Friday, so I really recommend looking into the sessions later this week to enjoy some additional excellent programming. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to the presenting team.
Great, thanks, Rachel. I'm just going to take a moment to set up my screen share. All right, hope everybody can see, and y'all let me know if there's an issue viewing any of the slide deck. I'm going to go ahead and get started, and we'll do some brief introductions. I'm Carolyn Runyon. I'm the Director of Special Collections at UTC. And when Rachel invited us to do this presentation, I was really excited because Professor Eckelmann Bergel and Professor McNutt and I have been collaborating on these kinds of projects for years now. So as we were pulling this together, I realized that we actually have quite a few things to say about open pedagogy projects and how we leverage special collections and history in those projects. So I'm gonna let Susan and Dunstan, of course, introduce themselves, but just to give you a brief overview, we're going to give you a really high-level overview of the kinds of projects we've done, and then we're going to move into sort of a Q&A format between the three of us, where we ask each other some questions, and then we'll open up to Q&A from you all. So without further ado, I'll kick it over to Susan so she can introduce herself.
Good morning, everyone. I was also delighted when Rachel reached out. It was nice to take stock of all the exciting things that Carolyn and Dunstan and I have done, and an opportunity to share the phenomenal work that our students have done as well, and how it has enriched the archives, our own experience as educators, and university archives. Again, my name is Susaneckermanburgle. I'm an associate professor of history here at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, and I also direct the Africana Studies program.
Hey everyone, I'm Dunstan McNutt. I sort of feel like the new kid on the block here. I've been collaborating with these two fine folks for a couple of years now, but they'd already established some really great projects before I arrived here a few years ago, and I work as the liaison to the history department, so it's been kind of a natural collaboration, and we just want to thank Rachel and all the organizers for putting this together and letting us be a part of this great week of events.
So I'm going to start with the overview of kind of what we've done. And again, each of these overviews could be presentations in and of themselves. So they're really high level, but um, I'm hopeful that we can delve into some of the details as we go through the Q&A. So one of the first kinds of projects that we started was, I think this was back in 2016, we started doing oral histories together, which feels like a lifetime ago, especially given the events of the past year. This is when, you know, Susan and I were baby little assistant professors here at UTC, and we were sort of cutting our teeth. And so it really began, Susan was part of the Mayor's Council for Women here in Chattanooga, which was organized by State Representative Joanne Favors and Councilwoman Carol Burrs. And there was this history committee, and Susan came to me and she said, I'm on this committee and I think we want to do some oral histories and we want to make those available. I was like, oh, great, let me in. So we started this collaboration, and it really started with one of the other area colleges doing sort of a service learning project to collect oral history interviews with women in Chattanooga. And it grew from there. It ended up being a collaboration that spanned three area colleges in town, including a number of really strong oral histories that supported an open pedagogy assignment for Susan's spring 2017 African American Women's History course. And the project spanned about 3 years, and we included interns in the project. We were just using a lot of different avenues and practices and experiential learning opportunities to bring folks into the project to create this sort of archive of women in Chattanooga that we could, that would agree to be interviewed and have those interviews published and archived at UTC. So we have a number of oral histories to date with women, and we're still sort of collecting on those. And Susan has been instrumental in really every part of that, from the course assignments to training other students on oral history best practices, students at other area colleges, that is, and also co-supervising internships that really seek to get students out into the community to conduct oral histories. The next project that we kind of undertook as an open pedagogy collaboration were these children's books. And so in spring 2018, Professor Eckelmann Bergel and I collaborated on this assignment for her 3000 level US Race and Childhood course. And the idea was that students would use primary source materials and secondary source materials to inform these narratives for children's books. And the books are archived in our institutional repository, UTC Scholar. And there have been some future plans maybe to collaborate with the art department on illustrations and that kind of thing, and to seek funding for that. And we'll talk a little bit about that later in our Q&A session. The next project that we worked together on was in fall 2018, and this was for Susan's 3000 level undergraduate course entitled The Modern Civil Rights Struggle. And so this is when things really started to gel, because Susan organized this really great field trip to the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, and we had a series of 4 instruction sessions to kind of build out these exhibition panels using materials in special collections. So over those instruction sessions, we taught students to identify, interpret, and select sources. We did a peer review where they reviewed each other's draft copies, and then we created these sort of pop-up exhibition posters in collaboration with the library studio team, which is the area in the library that sort of focuses on digital media literacy, things like film editing, video editing, poster presentations, and those kinds of interactive projects. So we've also done a lot of open pedagogy assignments around exhibitions from interns from the Department of History and the Departments of English. An art history class used our digital collection of pre-Columbian ceramics from Central America to establish an exhibition catalog. So really, Susan and I cut our teeth on one kind of exhibition, and it's just sort of grown into other partnerships and special collections where we can provide support for those kinds of assignments that really marry high impact practices with open pedagogy assignments. And most recently, in fall 2019, which really seems like a long time ago, and it really wasn't that long ago, but the pandemic really has wrought such havoc on our lives. The three of us, Professors Eckelmann, McNutt, and I, collaborated on an assignment to develop lesson plans for K through 12 instructors. And these lesson plans were really great. They used local history sources available in special collections, and they allowed these 4,000 level students of history in African American history since 1865 to develop some skills that they might use as future teachers. Many of our history students are also education majors who are looking to go into K through 12 instruction. So that is a really super high level overview of what we've been doing. But I think for me, the take home is we're looking at everything. We're trying to engage interns, classes, instructors, one-on-one sort of independent study assignments to get folks in here and develop these projects that we can publish online and give our undergraduate students this space to sort of display their undergraduate research through our institutional repository or our digital library, depending on the format and that sort of thing. So I'll start by asking the first question of my colleagues here, Dunstan and Susan. What motivates you to design or contribute to open pedagogy projects?
Great question. And thank you for the overview, the ambitious overview, Carolyn. What motivates me to design and contribute to open pedagogy projects? Open pedagogy projects are appealing to me because they allow me to, one, break down the work that historians do. It also allows me to diversify course designs, and it helps me connect the classroom to community issues and the community at large to really introduce who is this community that we live in. And there are really two ways that occurs, or where I pull ideas. On the one hand, I look at what are the skill sets that students I want them to get out. So those skill-based learning outcomes often dictate new ideas for assessment and course contents as well. So assignments that address methodological issues and historiographical gaps through experiential learning are a product out of open pedagogy projects. For instance, and Carolyn has already mentioned the oral histories, one of the themes in my African American women's history course focuses on sexual violence, gender oppression, and silence, whether voluntary or forced in the historical record. And so as historians, we rely on testimony to uncover the past. So this course opened up a methodological opportunity to generate new evidence through oral histories. And students recovered the voices of local Black women through which they could then link the racist past or racial past of Chattanooga to course themes that highlighted nationwide systemic racism. And the other avenue sort of that informs, that motivates me to think about open pedagogy is, of course, the course contents themselves. And there I wanted to share two examples that how that connected. My course on race and American childhood explores thematically histories of socialization. So how do young Americans learn racist ideas through mass culture, including children's books. So this particular thematic thread then shaped an assignment that involved students creating a children's book to think about audience, to think about genre, to think about children's learning experiences. And so these children's books then connected historical contents to and children's socialization that we had talked about in the class. And another example that really highlights what motivates me about open pedagogy was happened during my course on the modern civil rights movement, which prepared students to engage with local activism, but also public history, which is something that is dear to my heart, to communicate not only the discipline, but historical problems to a wider audience. So the final product in my modern civil rights movement course was a public exhibit, which again would take students into the archive and then create something that we hadn't yet, that it hadn't yet existed, but now has informed has traveled throughout campus. And we actually, Carolyn and I have talked about potentially working with the Hunter Museum, which is a local museum on American history, to potentially feature those exhibits there too. So to increase the audience of the students' work. And I'll take it over, give it virtual microphone back to Carolyn.
So one of my motivations for doing these kinds of projects, because they are really labor intensive. That overview doesn't really do them justice on how much time and effort these take, but they're extremely worthwhile. I think these really help us get students into special collections in a way that it has been you know, it's more than your typical one-shot instruction session where you just come in and show a student, okay, here's how you find something. It really gets them in there working with something, some of our primary source materials, and they get exposure to the materials and services that we have in special collections and how they might use that in really productive ways that are, you know, maybe a little bit career oriented too. So I really like that, especially for an institution like UTC that's a mid-sized public school. I am personally, I really just like to get more stuff online. So one of the things that I really enjoy about these projects is that I get to publish a whole bunch of stuff online. It's really exciting. We do this great collaboration. It gets student research online. It builds content for special collections. The students are the content creators, which I think is really great. It also helps the library, the unit that special collections is housed under, and other departments meet UTC's mission by offering experiential learning opportunities and focusing on these high impact practices in the classroom. So I think that's important. Our administrators see that we have a role in supporting instruction in that way. That's really important. And then sometimes these collaborations, for example, the K through 12 lesson plans have really been part of meeting a community demand. So we had a local history museum that shut down a few years ago, and in collaboration with our colleagues at the public library, we've assumed responsibility for their collections. And that local history museum had this really great community education outreach coordinator that did all this awesome work with the K through 12 demographic in Chattanooga. And one of the things that we found is we were really struggling to support that in any way because we're not, you know, sort of a museum with that kind of focus. So one of the reasons we did the lesson plans in particular was to kind of help meet that need and give K through 12 teachers in the community some local history resources that they might incorporate into the classroom. And Dunstan, I'll kick it over to you.
Yeah, so I'll just build a little bit off of what's already been said. For me, especially in the context of the assignment where students were developing lesson plans using materials from primary source collections here at UTC and in the Chattanooga area for K through 12 educators here in the area. I think it just does such a great job of improving student learning in the classroom and providing a really authentic research experience for students, while also sort of contributing moving forward to learning in the community. And so it seems, this project in particular seemed like such a great opportunity to provide students a really highly motivated project where they knew that their projects were going to be public facing. This wasn't just going to be a research paper that one professor saw and then never saw the light of day. So it improves the motivation on the part of the students to engage in authentic research and to put forward a project that they feel proud of. And then we just get the added bonus of this being in an institutional repository that other people can use, and other students can get a real sense of the history of civil rights in a community that they're a part of. So for me, it's just such a natural fit of kind of best practices for teaching, and then also just being good members of a community and a educational community more broadly. So I think that brings us into the practical question. So that's kind of our motivations, what drives us. But I'd like to hear more from the two of you about how you get these things off the ground. How do you translate these sort of ideals and lofty goals into manageable projects?
Another great question. I'm an archival historian. I love the archives, I fetishize documents, and I love working with previously overlooked documents, understudied documents. That kind of work is exciting to me. And I want my students to have that same experience because I enjoy discovering knowledge and seeing how knowledge is being produced in an archive through that work is exciting to me. So I want the students to have a similar experience. And this is what leads me to the archive, is what are sort of a natural transition. I have an idea, I have a class, I want students to have hands-on experience. And when I learned that UTC has a really robust special collections, it was sort of an immediate pathway. So my direct call or email usually goes to Carolyn Runyon. And she mentioned earlier, we were relatively new to UTC, so we kind of grew with the institution as well. And I reach out to her, and really the way to think about devising and refining course contents and assignment is to see what's available. And so I ask her, what are the collections? What kind of staffing do we have available? What workflows exist in any given collaboration? And then what does it look like and what does it take to preserve contents and materials? So those are the kinds of questions that I ask myself and that really lead me to Carolyn to before we even really think about the next steps. So Carolyn, you can probably speak to the next stage a little bit more too.
Thanks, Susan. This is sometimes the most nebulous part. You know, we have all these great ideas, and how do we actually make them actionable? And so it often starts off with sort of just an email. This is what I'm thinking this semester from Susan or another instructor, and then we typically have some sort of meeting and schedule touch-base meetings over the course of the semester to bring everything to fruition. But some of the other mechanisms that have helped us is Susan and I have used a number of grants to purchase equipment, recording equipment, in particular for oral histories, and also to support either creating transcripts or polishing transcripts that have been generated by students in classes when they've done oral history assignments. So we look to those to also help us get these off the ground. Or sometimes I'll just ask my boss, hey, I need a couple $1,000s for a bunch of stuff. And sometimes there's money and sometimes there's not. It depends. That sometimes depends on what time of year it is. But some of this planning has really helped us to do a little bit more. Other times we've, so for example, for the lesson plans, we had this really great intern in special collections who I'd asked the previous semester to develop some guidelines and a template for how we might do lesson plans. And that really helped us out when we came to the lesson plan assignment for the course, because there were some examples for other students to look at that had been done by undergraduate students. And there were some guidelines and templates that we could draw on and simplify for the assignment. So that really gave us a lot of structure for that. So sometimes these projects sort of they start with kind of a, maybe a broader idea, and through discussion we narrow down based on what do we have in place that might support this, what kind of structures or documentation do we have in place um, to get them off the ground. And it doesn't hurt that we're all really enthusiastic about them, so maybe that's the real key.
Yeah, and I'll just say on kind of the practical level is keeping the goals front and center and structuring the teaching environment to meet those goals. And sometimes that requires sacrifices in terms of the amount of course content that you can cover, because honestly, these authentic research experiences translate into other classes, into future professional goals. And so in the case of the lesson plans, we devoted, I think, 4 instruction sessions to every step of that research process, as well as the theory around good teaching practices and development of those lesson plans. So we had to have conversations about how much time was required to get the students to where they needed to be and be really successful in their products. And that was driven by our final goals, the intended outcomes. And so making those priorities accordingly.
I'm curious to hear you two talk a little bit about why collaborating is so important to you.
So one of the reasons, I mean, I think that I've been a natural collaborator for a long time. So some of it I think is personal preference, but also there is no way that special collections alone um, could get this work done. During some of these projects, I was the only full-time professional person or a, not a student assistant working in special collections through some of these projects. So the amount of work that we can get done and the amount of new resources we can provide through these projects is one of the big reasons I like to collaborate. The other reason, I'm currently working with a faculty member, and we're co-mentoring a student assistant who's working on this really great project to create an exhibition of some pre-Columbian art that we have in special collections. And it's a weird collection to be in Chattanooga. There's a weird donor thing going on there, if you're wondering. So one of the things that is so great about that is this art history professor has specialized in Latin American art history, and that is an area of expertise I just don't have. So by working with these subject specialists, historians, archaeologists, art history folks, English faculty, all these different people are bringing this really rich subject expertise, and I can focus on what I think I do best, which is the archival part, the part where sort of my training comes in focus. How do we make sure that we can archive this, we can put this online, that we're not doing things like violating copyright, or we're getting the right permissions, and provide some of that structure to make sure that the project is successful. So it really, I think the team-based approach allows us each to focus on our sort of areas of specialty, and so the faculty member will bring this really great subject expertise. I'll bring sort of this archival knowledge and how do we do this, and all these little picky technical details that we might need to set up a repository. And then Dunstan will bring all this great pedagogical knowledge to enhance how we teach students to do this work. So for me, it makes sense because we can all really focus on what we're best at, and then the student gets the best of multiple different people, and it kind of models also for me what we do in the workplace every day. Nobody knows everything. We all have to rely on each other. So I think that's a nice sort of teaching by example kind of thing that Dunstan can probably put in like real pedagogical talk.
Well, I won't try to go beyond what you said on that front, because I think you said it really nicely. But I think it also just provides a lot of energy. You know, I have sort of my certain routines in the classroom, and I have certain content that I'm used to covering, especially in history classes, and having the opportunity to meet prior to the semester and get some new ideas and think about a project that's more than just one library session or something like that just generates a lot of enthusiasm, makes the projects feel more authentic, makes the classroom time feel more energized, and I think that the students feed off of that energy. And on top of that, I think it helps sort of what Carolyn spoke to in terms of that art history collaboration, is it helps generate ideas for other collaborations. So when folks in other departments see the kind of work that happens in collaboration between library professionals and teaching faculty, it, I think, generates enthusiasm within the institution about other possibilities. And so I think it's really sort of personally rewarding because it helps keep me motivated and engaged, but I think it also has a benefit of motivating others and giving other people ideas that maybe they hadn't considered before.
Yeah, and I want to chime in, and of course, echoing everything that Dunstan and Carolyn said about outsourcing expertise. We have such a phenomenal team here at UTC, and utilizing those human resources is really critical. And Dunstan, you put it very nicely about energizing the classroom and energizing the work and that we do as really through these open pedagogy opportunities has been demonstrated. For me, why do I collaborate? It's also to diversify the classroom experiences for the students, to see the range of what is possible in terms of education. And as a historian, of course, I want to broaden their understanding of what historians do, that it's not just the archive, but that there's something that comes out of that archival experience and that can affect a lot of different communities, different pockets of American society. And I want to demystify the disciplinary practices. So Dunstan is especially helpful in sort of breaking down some of those tasks and helping them get from an idea and translating that into a product. And I also think that when they go into the archive, they're encountering issues, challenges, and it's not just to resolve those challenges in the archive in respect to a particular assignment, but I think by working through some of those challenges, I think that's applicable in a broader context too, like work through the project, figure it out. And then lastly, we work as a team. Carolyn and Dunstan and I, we've done this now for several years. We've definitely developed different skill sets through that too. But for the students to watch us model that teamwork process, I think is useful too. And I tell my students it's a professional skill. Most jobs these days involve some sort of professional interaction where collaboration really brings out the best in any team and in any institution. And that needs to be practiced. It's not something that you just do right off the bat. In fact, I think our collaboration has grown over time. And so by showing the students the benefits, but also to show some humility, to show, sometimes we need to adjust timelines, workflows, and to show how we resolve those issues meaningfully and thoughtfully, to really think on our feet as these projects come to fruition is important for students to see. And so beyond the intellectual impulses that drive my collaboration. I think they're also very practical and professional skills that define that motivation. And I have based on just following up on what we've talked about, I mentioned some challenges potentially. So Carolyn and Dunstan, maybe you can speak to that too. What are the challenges of open pedagogy, and perhaps how have you resolved them?
So I think with any sort of project like this, for example, for oral histories, if Susan conducted every one of our oral histories, I have no doubt they would all be spectacular and really great and well researched and excellent questions. And sometimes when you're working with students, the projects aren't quite at that professional level. It doesn't, despite all the training that they receive in the classroom, you'll get, there are some students that do really, really great work, and there's some students that are like, okay, I just need to get through this. So I have really come to, we're trusting and relying on undergraduate student work here. We're doing it to produce a professional project and content, and sometimes that can be hard not to be like, oh, I want to edit that, I want to do this, you gotta leave it alone. So that is a challenge for me sometimes, that the work maybe isn't exactly what I would do, but the learning piece of that for the students is great, and a lot of the contributions are incredibly high quality content. So there are just some that I'm like, okay, we could have done that a little bit differently. And so that for me is, when we put something online, that's one of the challenges that I face. Susan, what about you?
Certainly, I want to echo some of the points you've already made. But for me, the biggest challenge is, as I sort of try to balance work contents and skill-based outcomes, I think creating a manageable workflow that helps students on the one hand to understand the process of research, learn something, but also not overwhelming them with practical details and logistical details. And there's a lot to explain about preservation and history. And then there's the content of the class, and they're doing a lot of reading. So just managing that and keeping that in mind for the students, and show some compassion on their part. For us, we've been trained, we've dealt with these terms and these processes for quite some time, but the students, they're new to this. So being patient with them and really working very hard to create something that doesn't overwhelm them. I think that remains a challenge. Dunstan mentioned the K through 12 workshops that we hosted where students created lesson plans. I think that was probably one of the bigger challenges, just because there were so many levels to that assignment, in addition to the actual content and the archival research that we had to master and convey to the students. I found that to be particularly challenging. Then the other thing, depending on the class level, and that touches on something that Carolyn has said, is that students come in with a wide range of skill sets. Some have taken history classes with me or my colleagues before, so they have a kind of a vocabulary already at hand. They're maybe even familiar with oral histories and participating in such projects. So I'm dealing with, especially my upper level, which tend to be electives, with a really wide set of different students, different skills, different backgrounds, different motivations for the class, why they entered it. So managing that has been difficult as well. And just making sure to carefully consider and make additional adjustments throughout. That remains the challenge. And but yeah, I think we've mastered it. I think most of the time. And what about you, Dunstan? Can you think of anything that sort of stands out to you that we haven't yet addressed?
Yeah, I feel like this is sort of, as I was thinking about this, I had a motivation to answer it one way, and I feel like I've sort of turned it on its head, because at one time, I think I would have said one of the challenges is drawing on open educational resources is that sometimes you don't have as slick of an interface, or there might not be, to be concrete, when we're dealing with accessing primary sources. There's lots of database vendors that want to provide really shiny products with all sorts of primary source material that is proprietary and hard to get to. And sometimes relying on local collections can be challenging to introduce students to, but increasingly I'm finding the types of things that folks at universities, at museums, at archives are making materials more and more available. And really this is better for students long-term, because they have to think about how information ends up where it is preserved and made accessible. And I think that's a more translatable skill. So at one time, I think I would have said the challenge is moving past the kinds of library resources and library databases we often point students to. And I think that landscape is shifting in meaningful ways. And I think the more folks like us collaborate on projects like this, the better that it gets moving forward. So I feel like that's sort of the challenge that's not really a challenge, but I think that's how my thinking has evolved in recent years.
How do you think we measure success, or how should, I guess, how do we measure success? And maybe what do we really ideally want to do to measure success that maybe is hard?
Let me jump in, and as the instructor of the record, I am in the end the one who is assigning grades, but that's not ultimately how I measure the success of this open pedagogy. In short, I'd say I think the students' enthusiasm watching that unfold is one way I measure success, because that kind of enthusiasm is carried well beyond the classroom, well beyond a semester, well beyond undergraduate education. Watching them develop intellectual curiosities is a way I measure these collaborations. Observing them developing skill sets is important. Honing particular writing skills, verbal skills, and analytical skills. These are ways I measure success. And lastly, I think we've talked about this overview of all the collaborations. It's actually the products well beyond the semester. They outlast that particular semester. Carolyn said that some of the projects we've done have really met a demand in the community, have been utilized. Carolyn may be able to speak to the visitors on our website who've looked at these oral histories. That's kind of how I measure success. And having talked to students, of course, and having them shared, they often say, this was a really hard class. This was a really hard assignment. The different components were difficult to manage at times, but I realized something, that projects sometimes are not confined to a particular semester, and that the challenges is actually part of the learning experience. At least verbally, students have communicated that. And to me, that's how I measure success of these collaborations.
Susan alluded to some of the things that we use. For anybody who's in libraries, in the presentation, of course, we're reporting our stats to ACRL and iPads and things like that. So, some of the successes are codified, that we pull out the sheer number of editions or the Google Analytics. What I don't know is, I don't know who's using this stuff. So, if we have a student who's working on one of these kinds of projects, and I don't have any way of knowing if it's actually a K through 12 educator downloading the material, or if it's the student's mom who's taken a look at it. There's plenty of those kinds of downloads happening when we produce these student projects. So, one of the things that we don't know are some of those kinds of things, because once you put it online, nobody emails you anymore and be like, hey, I'm going to use this cool thing. So it's not like it's not like a visit in the archives when I have some sense of how it's being used, because I'm interacting with the researcher. But we do sort of the typical reporting. And then for me personally, the success is sort of building these relationships with students. There have been students who have done oral histories as part of a class assignment, and then they move on and they want to do an internship in special collections, and then they ask me for a rec letter so they can go to grad school and study archives and records management or librarianship. And that is really the exciting part, to see how these open pedagogy projects can kind of introduce them to some archival historical research methods, but also some archival work, and you know, maybe create, you know, a career path for them. So for me, that's the part that's really exciting. And so I'll send it over to Dunstan for his thoughts.
Yeah, I think a lot of what I see in terms of success has been mentioned. I'll just add one other thing. A lot of times from a library instruction standpoint, we don't get to see the products of the work that students do. And so I might go give my 1 or 2 classes and then see a few of the students in research appointments, but I don't know how the papers turn out unless a professor lets me know after the fact. And with these, I actually not only see the process, but I usually see the product, and that's a kind of measure of success that I don't normally get in my job. So that's really gratifying. In the interest of time, if my co-presenters are okay with it, I feel like we might want to skip over the last question to open it up for a Q&A from folks who have taken their valuable time to join us today. If there are any questions people have, if they want to throw them into the chat, we're right at 9:45, but I've got a few minutes. I'm happy to hang out and answer any questions that come up, if I may be so bold to volunteer some time on my co-presenters. And we just want to thank everybody again for spending the morning hour with us, and for the folks putting together this excellent week of programming. We're really glad to be a part of it, and glad to share, in the spirit of open pedagogy, glad to share these kinds of projects to a larger audience, because that's what it's all about. So we'll wrap things up there, but again, if there are any questions, feel free to drop those into the chat. And as we're waiting, are there any concluding remarks or any closing thoughts that we should leave folks with?
I just want to thank everybody for joining and listening in, and maybe there are future collaborations that extend to the region, since I've heard that a lot of folks from the wider Tennessee area are joining us today. That's something that Carolyn and I have talked about as well, to think about regional collaborations. So that's something that someone might be interested in. I'd love to hear from you. And thank you for joining this morning.
Yeah. Yes, thanks everybody for joining. And if there aren't any questions, we can sort of do our final prepped question, and we'll keep an eye on the chat. But our final question for each other was, how does open pedagogy align with your professional values? And oh, thanks, Suzanne, in the chat. And so I wanted to speak a little bit about this, because one of the professional values that Archivist has is this idea of transparency and openness. And these projects really give students a behind the scenes look at what it means to produce knowledge, and see what archival work looks like. And it's kind of a riff on that sort of themes and archives of the postmodern approach to curation and participatory archiving and those kinds of things. So that's one of the reasons that I really like these kinds of projects. I'm monitoring the chat now. We've got a question from David. When you create new OER archive materials, do you have a process in place to make sure these materials are accessible to those with disabilities? It's a good question. It depends on the project. We do our best to make sure that we're doing accessibility checks on, say, PDFs that are uploaded and that kind of thing. When we do projects, for example, when I have an intern or something that's working on a project like an online exhibition, we're making sure that we're compliant with W3C, C3, I can't remember anymore, standard, those accessibility standards. And we work with the library's IT train to make sure that's true. So when students are working on this, I have them develop alt tags for images that are really good, and making sure that we're making sure that content is accessible. When we do oral histories, it's always one of my goals to make sure that we are providing a transcript so that folks can read if they can't hear it. So we really try to do that to the very best of our ability, recognizing that not everything is perfect and 100% is as accessible as I would like. So maybe in a few years, if I can get a digital collections archivist on board, we'll be able to devote some more resources to that. But that is something I think about when we're designing the projects, when particularly oral histories, when someone comes to me, I'm like, okay, I'm going to have to dedicate some staff time, usually in the way of paid student assistance, to making sure that we transcribe these and make these as widely usable as possible. And that also serves our purposes for making them searchable. So we're pretty focused on that. Other folks have some thoughts about accessibility?
I'll just say that the last year has been a little bit of a wake up call for me in terms of teaching and having time to add a couple of steps in to make sure that the materials that I would normally use in a classroom, that I feel like I have a little more control of in terms of knowing what students I'll be working with and knowing any accessibility needs. Whereas now, teaching in some cases completely online, I have to think about all of that as a part of my process. And so just the materials that I'm creating that might be hands-on or made accessible with collaboration with the faculty member that I'm working with now, that's getting sort of baked into the preparation. So the course materials that are getting used are made accessible as well as the end product, if that makes sense. So I feel like that's becoming a part of my thinking more and helping inform how I think about the end product as well. And I'll just say, back to that question, in terms of the professional values, it really goes back to my early library days in library school, where we talked about how much material, and I'm probably preaching to the choir, but how much material is produced on the sort of taxpayer dollar, right? So much research, so much labor goes into the creation of scholarship that then is not accessible to the people who essentially funded it. And so being involved in projects like this, I think, speaks to greater librarianship values of openly accessible materials. And so the resources that a community is putting into a university becomes the available resources and available information for that community. And so I think it really translates quite nicely. And I think it benefits students for thinking more intentionally about how information is organized and made accessible and preserved. And so that meets that kind of that information literacy, or that kind of sort of library instruction value.
Yeah, and I'll chime in as the faculty member. Mentorship, disciplinary renewal, and academic rigor are really key pillars of the professional values that I strive for in my own little world. And open pedagogy really gives opportunities to hone those values and then really see them unfolded too.
So speaking to Susan's earlier point about regional collaborations, Carolyn, do you want to bump us to the last slide? I won't speak for y'all, but I'm more than happy to talk more about this kind of thing. I know my co-presenters are too. So don't hesitate to reach out beyond this session if you don't have a question right now. I think all of us are open to thinking about how these kinds of projects could be scaled more broadly, or if you have questions about how any of these projects unfolded, we'd be happy to chat further about that. So we're pretty easy to track down, but we've got our contact information there.
Well, thanks everybody for attending. I see we're losing folks. We can hang out here a few more minutes if folks want anything, but also, feel free to move on with your day as well. And thanks so much. Thanks to Rachel for pulling this together as well.
Yeah, thank you for joining everybody, and co-presenters. Looking forward to the next opportunities. And thank you, Rachel, for bringing us together and giving us an opportunity to reflect a little bit too.